Alright, welcome to the next segment of the video, which is we're going to talk about the net reach, and also we're going to talk about some frequency and so on. And at the end also we're going to talk about the costs, the advertisement costs, whether it's actually worth it to actually spend that much amount of advertisement to gather this much people. Now first we're going to bring your attention to net reach. So net reach, in what we call net reach, is basically the advertisement or different advertisement can have the sort of the same effect. What do I mean by that? So say that you place an advertisement on Saturday Age and Sunday's Age. So basically you place the advertisement on the weekend. Now, those people who watch or who just read Saturday, let's say they are 950k. So this is people, right? So I'm just going to put that. So there are 950k people who are going to read your advertisement. The same thing on Sunday as well, right? Lesser people read in this case. There are 700k. But there is this group of people who actually read, which is technically very common. I mean, if you tend to read Saturday, you tend to read Sunday as well. There are 500,000 of people who actually read both. Now, if you're spending the same, like if you're spending different amount of money for Saturday and Sunday, but technically these people actually have already seen that twice. So in terms of reach, so if you remember reach is the number of person who have watched at least once. Well, you are actually counting the 500,000 again. All right, so these people are actually watching it 2 times. All right, but still considered as the same 500,000 reach. And in here, those people who just look on the Sunday, which is, you have to deduct this number to get the blue circle. So which is 950k minus 500k. So that will give me 450k, and in the red circle it will be 700k minus 500k. That will give me 200k. So if you add up 500k plus 200k plus 450k, this will give you a net reach of 1.15 million. So you can see that in here, the net reach. Okay, so it's not just simply adding 950k plus 700k. It's not that. It's basically you add, you have to deduct those people who actually saw twice, because net reach is, or not net reach, but reach itself is basically we want to look if they have seen at least once. So, well, they call it net reach in here is because it's just to emphasize that only unduplicated audience. So if you see that, so they're this duplicated audience. So make sure that we have to deduct them such that only unduplicated audience actually been exposed at least once. That's the idea of what they call net reach. So I hope that makes sense. And in the next part, we're going to talk about some frequency response model. Now, the frequency response model, what it actually helps you is to capture the relationship between the advertising outcome and frequency. Now, if you see that there are 3 different kinds of frequency response models. Now, the first one is what we call linear. So probably you've heard of the word linear before. Well, linear is just like that, where it's linear, it's progressing the same, it has the same what we call gradient or rate of change. So if you look at the definition in here, it's that the effectiveness increases linearly with each exposure. So as you have more exposure, and therefore the effectiveness increases. So if you have this exposure as versus to this exposure, you can see that increasing exposure, increasing effectiveness. So it's all going up. It's like an upward sloping curve. The second one is what we call the learning curve response. Now, why they say that it follows what we call the S-shaped curve. So if I can just draw it right here. Okay. So here is called the same thing again. This is effectiveness and this is exposure. Now in this case, actually, there are few customer, or if we learn from the previous chapters on bus model, we have this like the innovators, right? So this is what we call innovators in the advertising, where people watch first. So there are few exposure, then your grow is a bit less. So you just grow in a very small effect, I would say. Then after a certain time, it just shoots up. So you can see that in here. All right, it just shoots up from here up to here. So it's having that steep effect where now, because there is a lot of exposure, it's just rapidly increasing as the audience actually know what you want to say. So it's sort of absorbing your message. But let's say if everyone or almost everyone heard about your advertisement, what do? Well, again, it's going to grow at a slow effect. Why? Because the fact that people have already learned, all right, they call it what we call a message saturation, means people have been saturated already with your advertisement. And sometimes you might say that, okay, I got sick of that already. So that's what this is all about. Now the last one is what we call a threshold response. So the threshold response, it's saying here that advertising has no effect until it reach certain exposure or threshold. So in this case, that starting from, let's say from zero, so from zero up till a few exposure, maybe there is nothing, so it has no effect. But maybe after that, there is this stepping up as your exposure increases. And then what happened? And again, it come back to no effect. So what they are saying in here is that only in certain exposure, let's say from this exposure up till this exposure, this is where advertising has effect. And after that, it has no effect after everyone sort of gets the message. So again, to recap, here is what we have learned so far. The first one is the linear response function, where basically as everyone, as the exposure increases, then effectiveness will also increases along with exposure. The second one is the learning curve, which is the one that looks like the S-shaped curve. So you can see that at first no one knows about your advertisement, and then for some reason it shoots up. Yep. And after that, it just getting back into the decreasing mode because people have already know your advertisement. Lastly, it is the threshold function, where the only time where there is an effect is when the exposure has a steep curve. So something like that up till here. So this is where the advertisement have an effect. All right. In all other exposure, it has none. So that's what a frequency response model is all about. Now, next we're going to move on to what we call the effective frequency. Okay, so there's the word frequency in here. So we talk about there is net reach, there is also now effective frequency, and later on we're going to look at effective reach and so on. So what does it mean by effective frequency? Well, if you sort of hear the word effective, it means that you need to say that how effective means how good or how productive. So when you say about effective, which means that you might want to associate that with productivity. So how productive? So in this case, effective frequency is that each advertisement requires a minimum number of impressions. Now this is what we call effective frequency. So it's the minimum number of impression. Why is that so? Well, it's needed because if you have a low number of impression, then pretty much it doesn't get registered into your head. So for example, if you just sort of watched it once, well, unless it's really important for you, probably the advertisement has no effect. So because of that, the effective frequency, again, it depends on your level of awareness of the brand. So Coca-Cola is one brand that you probably know. So again, it's easier to digest that. And they're releasing a new, let's say, energy drink. So although it's new, but you sort of think about, oh, let's say I drink Coca-Cola every day. So I know what they are saying is that they want to actually come up with a new energy drink. That gets easier in terms of the storage into your memory rather than having an unknown brand and promoting the same product, which is, let's say, energy drink. Their loyalty to the brand, right? So if you actually drink Coca-Cola every day, obviously you sort of know, then it gets registered again easier. Like how creative? So some advertisement, they use like emotion, they use the happiness, they use like different kind of technique to really make sure that it registered into your memory, especially the long-term memory. Last one, the level of influence sought by the marketer. So what sort of influence that you put under? So there is this wear in and wear out effect. So the wear in is basically the frequency required before given an advertisement or campaign achieve minimum level of effectiveness. So basically they're saying is that what's the frequency that's required? Now the wear out is the frequency at least a given advertisement begin to lose effectiveness. So, you know, wear in is where you are probably the first time using it. Yep, I like it. Wear out is like your shoes. So if you think about this analogy in like shoes, wear in is like when you actually first buy it. Okay. So you might use it quite often. So then that's probably what's the frequency required. And wear out is basically like, you know, your shoes already worn out and you probably say that, okay, I don't like it. And you probably search for the new one. So this is the frequency at least a given advertisement begin to lose your effectiveness. So that's what wear out is all about. So we have already effective frequency. Now we also have effective reach. Now effective reach is the number or percentage of audience that receive advertising message with a frequency, now this is important, equal to or greater than the effective frequency. So effectively what they are saying is that those people who have more exposure are technically captured by the model. So what do I mean by that? Let me show you an example. So the following table shows distribution of population across different exposure frequencies. Now, if the effective frequency is 3, so remember effective frequency is the minimum number of the frequency needed or minimum number of exposure needed. Okay, so calculate the effective reach. Well, if they say that the frequency is equal to or greater than, so if we have 3, so means that we are counting people with the number of exposure 3, right, which is 23,000. And we also going to count the number of exposure of 4. So that will be 11,000. So the effective reach that will be equal to people would have exposure number of 3, which is 23,000, plus 4, which is 11,000. Why? Because again, effective frequency is the minimum number of exposure. So anything after that, that is getting captured already by default. So 23 plus 11, that will give you 34,000. That is basically your effective reach. So I hope that makes sense. Now the next one is what we're going to do is the share of voice. So share of voice is the measure of the present, like measure of that advertising present that a specific brand or product actually enjoys. So in this case, it's defined as the brand advertising. So it can be how many times does the brand has advertised the product or something like that, or it can be in terms of the dollar value as well. How much does the brand actually spend on advertising? So divided by the total market advertising. So it can be in dollar or it can be in number. Now, if you see something like this, it's actually very similar. All right, this is very, very similar into what we have done in market share. Okay, so share of voice, it's basically very similar to market share, because if you think about it, market share is basically sales divided by the total market sales. So this is brand advertising divided by total market advertising. So think about share of voice is like a market share. So like how much have you actually spent? So in this case, it's like how much you have actually spent in comparison with your market total. All right. So like, for example, if you think about Coca-Cola, you might think about they might be spending more than their compatriots. Actually, not compatriots, they are competitors. Pepsi. Okay. Lastly, we're going to talk about comparing advertising costs. And in comparing advertising costs, we have what we call the cost per 1,000 impressions. So the cost of 1,000 impression is basically the cost of advertising divided by the impression generated in 1,000 impression. So in this case, it's that it helps you to find out whether you have been spending your money wisely for your advertising. So let's take a look at some of the example in here. So in here, it's saying that the cost of advertising is $411,500 and the audience size is 2.5 million. So as you can see in here, you're actually spending a bit less, but your audience size will not grow. It's actually not growing as much as, let's say, this one. So you see that in here, although the cost is a lot, but actually you are paying a lot more in terms of the cost. In here, you are actually spending a little bit less, and your audience grows a little bit better, and this will give you $96 per 1,000 impression. So you can see in here, actually more expensive advertisement doesn't equate into getting more audience. So in fact, if you calculate the effectiveness, the second one, which is Spot Illustrated, actually have a better advertising, I would say a better advertising medium, because the fact that you are just paying $96 per 1,000 people. In here, you are paying almost double. Now in here as well, the Super Bowl, let's say you spend 2.6 million, but the audience size is so much greater such that you are actually paying even much lesser as compared to the previous two. So in this case, there are two takeaways. First of all is that paying more does not equate to actually cheaper advertising. So it could be more expensive as well. It all depends on how many audience size that you can actually receive. So this is actually a good way to understand how to compare advertising costs. So ideally you want a cheaper one because you do not want to pay expensive. Costs, you always want less. Revenue, you always want more. All right, lastly, before we finish with this video, I'm just going to show you how to calculate any one of these. So for USA today, so the calculation, it will be the cost at, which is 411,500. Now the audience size is 2.5 million. So in this case, I will have to divide that by 2,524 point, so this is the decimal, 965. So you basically have to convert this into thousands, because the fact that they want to have the impression generated in thousands. So this will give you the 163. I'll show you one more. Let's say for this one. So Sports Illustrated. So this is going to be 302,680. Okay, divided by 3.1 million, have to be converted into thousands. So this will become 3,150 baht. So this will give you your 96. All right. Lastly, we also can calculate the advertising elasticity of demand. So if you remember what is elasticity, elasticity is basically responsiveness. How responsive are you? So in this case, we can also see how responsive are you to the advertisement. So we can see in here, the calculation will be the change of quantity demanded divided by the change in advertising spending. So all of this is in terms of percentage. So in this case, we want to see how responsive are most of our customers. Now, in this case, we have to answer this question here. So will advertising of demand be positive or negative? Now, this is all based on natural intuition. Now, if you ask yourself whether let's say if you increase in advertising, do you think you will get an increase in the quantity number of sales or decrease quantity sales? Okay, so I'm going to put question mark right here. So if you increase your advertising, would you increase the quantity of sales or decrease the quantity of sales? Now, obviously by intuition, if you increase the advertising, well, you hope, but in natural fact, you probably will increase your advertising sales. So an increase in advertising should also contribute to the increase in sales. Because of that, they are moving in the positive direction or in the same direction. This means that it is a positive effect. So this is actually different than our elasticity of demand or price elasticity of demand, which is normally negative. But in this case, my advertising elasticity supposed to give me a positive number. So let me just show you an example in here on how would you actually calculate elasticity of demand for advertising. So suppose that in period number 1, you have $10,000 and you increase your advertising budget by $500. This will translate from 300,000 of sales into 303,000 for sales. Now, how would you calculate your advertising elasticity of demand? So first of all, so if we look at the previous formula, is that the change of quantity demanded divided by change in advertising spending. So let me just write here first, change in quantity demanded. Now this is in percentage divided by change in advertising spending. So that's also in percentage. So let's do the first one, or the numerator. So change in quantity demanded So the way how you actually calculate change is that you can consider this as current and this is previous. So this means that you can calculate. So the way how you calculate percentage change, it will be the current minus previous divided by previous. So how do I actually do that? So let me just work out for the quantity demanded first. So the quantity demanded will be Q2 minus Q1 divided by Q1. And for advertising, it will be A2 minus A1 divided by A1. So this is what you should do. So we just replace this by all the numbers. So in here is 303,000 minus 300,000 divided by 300,000 all over A2, which is 10,500 minus 10,000 divided by A1, which is 10,000. So you can use your calculator to evaluate this, but I have done that before. All right, and the answer will be 0.2. Also, just to give you an idea, try to actually calculate this in your calculator, because I think that a lot of people are still struggling on how you should put this into your calculator. Now, if you have any question, you can feel free to ask me. Lastly as well, we are going to calculate advertising elasticity of demand in another way. So the way how would you actually do this is that you do a regression of sales and advertising spending, but the only difference is that your data has to be in ln. Okay, so if you don't know what ln is actually logarithm to the power of e. Okay, so the log of e is normally what we call ln. Now this is normally presented in your calculator as ln. So that's what you should do when you want to try to do a regression for sales and advertising. So you just basically have to regress ln of sales, which is your dependent variable, and your ln of advertising, which is your independent variable. So whatever the coefficient estimate right here, this will show you elasticity of demand of advertising. So coefficient like beta will give you what we call the advertising elasticity. All right, so that's all for this segment of the video. In the next segment, which is the last segment, I promise, that will talk about the online advertising matrix. So we will go through pretty much very similar to what we have done previously, but we're just gonna add a few more because online, has a different nature of calculating in terms of the matrix. So thank you very much, and I will see you in the last segment of the video.